Welcome. My name is Casey Dexter Lee, and I'm an interpreter with California State Parks. I'm here today at Angel Island State Park to share some of the stories here. We are very fortunate in California to have 280 California state parks protecting many of our natural and cultural resources, as well as providing recreation opportunities for the people of California and beyond. Angel Island is an island in the middle of San Francisco Bay. It has a long and diverse history. The first people to live here were the Coast Miwok. Today they're known as the Federated Indians of the Grayton Rancheria. And we want to acknowledge their lives here on Angel Island. This is also possibly the ancestral land of the Ohlone people as well. So when Europeans arrived here in San Francisco Bay, and to Angel Island in 1775, the world began changing. And there was a long history of the military using this island once this became part of the United States. The US Army was here for 99 years, from 1863 to 1962. There was a US quarantine station at this facility for about 60 years, from the late 1800s into the mid 1900s. And we were a US immigration station. Now, the US immigration station history, as well as the World War II history at this site, allowed this place to become a National Historic Landmark. It's only one of two National Historic Landmarks in the country that deal with Asian American history. The other is Manzanar, a former internment camp. So we are here today to talk a little about the Japanese history here at the immigration station, and later this facility became a prisoner of war processing facility, as well as temporary internment for Japanese Americans, particularly Japanese Hawaiians. I'm going to show you a little bit of what you can see from this location. We are up on the second floor of the detention barracks for the immigration station, and below us you can see the waterfront. We have kind of the footprint of the administration building that was at this site. And you can even see some boats. Angel Island is only accessible by boat unless you're a very good swimmer. So the folks that come to Angel Island are coming by ferry typically. Right now, we don't have a lot of ferry service. We do have it a few days a week. And hopefully, as the public health situation improves, we'll have additional ferry service out to the park. Now, the immigration station, as I mentioned, had an administration building. And the administration building was a large structure facing the water. And there was a pier or a dock that went out from that. That pier had a building that people could store their luggage in. And right behind the administration building, you can see peeking up the second story of the detention barracks where I am right now. Now, this facility processed people between 1910 and 1940. And the folks that were coming here were coming from all over the world. We had people coming from almost 80 different countries. Now, the largest groups were coming from China, Japan, India, and Russia. And so these groups had a similar experience here on the island, but there were major differences. And because people were coming here from all over the world, one of the major components in how people were treated were the laws that were in place at the time. Now, immigration laws between 1910 and 1940 did change, but the main laws that were being enforced here are the Chinese exclusion laws that started in 1882, which prohibited most Chinese immigrants from coming to the United States. There were exceptions, so everyone here is trying to fit into one of those exempt classes. There were laws in the 20s and the teens that affected other Asian immigrants' ability to immigrate. By 1924, it was almost impossible to immigrate if you were an Asian immigrant. Now, again, there were exceptions, people like students, tourists, diplomats, merchants, and teachers. They were able to come and go from the US. but they might end up at a place like Angel Island. Angel Island had a reputation. It was known as the guardian of the Western Gate. Its job was to keep people out. And people knew of the reputation of Angel Island and would even sometimes avoid coming through San Francisco's immigration station here by going to other ports on the West Coast. So they might go to Portland or Seattle or Los Angeles, trying to avoid the very strict enforcement of these anti-Asian and anti-Chinese laws that were in place at the time. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to take you inside of the detention barracks into a room where some Japanese immigrants were detained. Now, folks were detained on Angel Island for lots of reasons. They might have had issues with their paperwork. Maybe they didn't have all of their papers in place. Maybe they had an illness or had been exposed to illness, and they would need to have a medical screening here at the island. But many people were detained simply for being Asian, and that is a product of the laws that were in effect at the time. So as we look around this room, you can see we have triple layer bunk beds, and this is where people waited for their interview or their hearing. And so while you waited here, you didn't have a lot to do, but one of the things that became common was the practice of writing poetry. On the walls of the building in some of our rooms, there are poems written by Chinese immigrants. In other rooms, we have inscriptions from other groups, including Japanese, Korean, Russian, there's inscriptions in Spanish, Danish, Hindu, Gurmukhi, it goes on and on. We have about a dozen different languages. So the people here were expressing themselves, but the only poetry that's up on the wall is written in Chinese. All the other inscriptions are what you might call more typical graffiti. Now, all the writing in the building was graffiti at the time. It was not allowed. If the people doing it had been caught, they probably would have gotten into trouble. But today we look at this historic graffiti as a very significant, and we're very lucky that people wrote on the walls, because the writing here helps save this building from destruction. In the 1960s, the idea for this California State Park at Angel Island was really focused on recreation, getting people outside to enjoy nature, all great things. But they had a lot of old buildings on the island from all the military, immigration, quarantine use of this site. So they thought if they could just burn down those old, abandoned, dangerous buildings, they would have nice flat spots for camping, picnicking, recreating. Well, that was the plan for this building that I'm standing in today. But we were very fortunate because there was a ranger working here at the time. His name was Alexander Weiss, who had heard about the writing in the building. Now, he couldn't read it, but he had a kinship. He had an understanding of the people that were here because he himself had immigrated. He was an immigrant from Austria. His family had fled the Holocaust during World War II. So as a very young child, he came to the United States as an immigrant. And he was very curious about this place. He was also a lover of poetry. He went on to write some books of poems himself. And so he started talking to people, primarily at San Francisco State, about the writing here. Some of the professors and students were able to come out here on field trips, and they discovered this place for themselves. Many of those students went home. They would talk to their parents. Many of those students were Chinese American. And when they talked to their parents about this amazing place, Angel Island, they discovered for the first time that their parents had been here. And it was something their parents had not been very open about talking about in many families. And that was because of a fear of being deported. Many of the people, particularly coming from China, had come under false pretenses to avoid the very strict and racially constructed laws to exclude them from the country. So they had taken on false names, false identities to pretend to be the children of American citizens so that they might be able to enter. Now, those children being born here in the United States did not have those same fears of deportation, And they started a movement to save this place, to save this history. And so we always encourage people to look around your community and think about the places that you want to make sure are preserved for the next generation. So there were poems written in other languages, and those poems, while they didn't end up on the walls, often ended up in newspapers that were the same language as the author. So I'd like to read you one poem by a former detainee, and his name is Gozo Carl Yoneda. Now, he wrote under a pseudonym, Kiyohi Hama, and these poems that I'm going to read you throughout the program were all published in the Japanese language newspaper, Nichibei. This one says, "Angel Island, what a sweet home, but there are no angels here, only nameless immigrant prisoners." So the people staying here did think of themselves as prisoners often, and part of that has to do with the look of the building. Now, if I show you the window over here, you can see that there is a caging, a covering over the windows, and that was meant to keep people in so they wouldn't escape. There was also a fence around this building that had barbed wire at the top. And in addition to that, we are on an island. So escape was difficult. There were a few escapes, but not many. Most people that were coming through here, for the most part, you might say were on their best behavior. They were trying not to do anything that might give the American officials an excuse to deport them. So this room, as I said, has those triple layer bunks. This room was considered healthy for 25 to 30 people during the time period it was used. And the beds in here were somewhere in the range of 50 to 60 during the immigration era. So 2 to 3 times the healthy capacity. Now the beds, they do fold up. So if a bed was not in use, you could lock it into an upright position to create some more space to move around. Now, because people arrived by boat, large groups would arrive, the rooms would be more full. As people were allowed to either leave or were deported, the room occupancy would come down and those beds would be more in the way than useful. So that's one reason you might lock them up. Now there's no ladders or steps. You actually have to step on the beds to work your way up to the top bunk if you're sleeping up on the top. So I would like to show you a little bit around this room. And while we do that, I'm going to read you another poem from Carl. Tears in my eyes have dried up. After several days of incarceration, no more tears of sadness, no more tears of anguish. Now, Carl mentions being incarcerated or detained here for several days, and that was fairly typical for immigrants coming from Japan. And the reason that Japanese immigrants were only here a few days compared to, say, Chinese immigrants whose average stay were 3.5 weeks and were realistically either 2 to 3 days or 3.5 months if you take away that average of 3 weeks. The Japanese experience of detention was typically shorter because of the power of the Japanese government. The United States and Japan had worked out what is commonly known as the Gentleman's Agreement. Basically, Japan agreed to slow the exodus of Japanese laborers because those were the unwanted classes here in the United States. Now, this all goes back to labor. The Chinese had come as a labor force, were actually enticed to come during the gold rush and building of the railroads. But as anti-Chinese sentiment grew and the Chinese exclusion laws were passed, fewer Chinese laborers were able to immigrate. A lot of that labor force was replaced by Japanese laborers. So by Japan slowing that exit of Japanese people to come to work in the United States, it helped with the relationship between the American government and Japan regarding immigration. There was also a lot of emphasis on assimilation and trying to adapt American ways for Japanese immigrants during this time period. It was seen as a way of strengthening the diplomatic relationship between the two countries from the perspective of the Japanese government. Now, that didn't stop people from developing anti-Japanese sentiment like they had anti-Chinese sentiment. And in some ways, this desire for Japanese abroad to adapt to American ways was used against Japanese people living in the United States, where anti-Japanese Americans would use their ability to speak English and adapt to American culture as a further threat to American culture. And there was a lot of racism during this time aimed at the Japanese. Now, for a long time, the Japanese government was able to avoid restrictive laws against their citizens abroad by negotiating and working with the US government, but mostly by slowing down their own people from coming to the United States. So when in 1924, the door closes on most Asian immigration with the Immigration Act, we see a decrease in the number of Japanese coming into Angel Island and San Francisco. But we think about 85,000 people from Japan passed through Angel Island on their way to the US. So many of those people were picture brides. And so what I'd like to do is share a few photos that we have. Now the picture brides that came through Angel Island were fairly well photographed. And part of that is probably due to the fact that the women were wearing very beautiful clothing. And we see this a little bit, kind of a historic bias in old photos. There's not very many photos of men wearing suits because men wearing suits kind of look the same. But the photographers seem to be drawn to people that were wearing more traditional clothing, colorful clothing, and that tended to be the women. Now you can see these women are inside of the registry with a few men as well. We did have quite a few picture brides coming through, and the women, when they arrived, the United States until 1917 did not recognize the picture bride marriages. They did not acknowledge the validity of the marriage that took place in Japan without the groom. Now, it's pretty unusual because most marriages were acknowledged from other countries, and this was kind of an exception. So the women would arrive, they would often have to pass a medical screening, and then a brief interview usually took place, or an immigration hearing. The questions weren't tremendously long for Japanese immigrants, they mostly because of all that screening that was happening before departing the country of Japan. Now, the women who stayed here mostly would have stayed in the second floor of the administration building. There was a short time when women stayed here in the barracks, but due to segregation of the sexes, women were mainly in the administration building. There was also racial segregation within the immigration station into three categories: European, Asian, and Chinese. Chinese people were separated out from other Asian groups because of the Chinese exclusion laws, and Japanese were considered Asian under these segregation rules. Now, as I mentioned, there is writing in this building from Japanese immigrants. And so right here on the wall is one of the oldest inscriptions that is known in the building. And I have a photograph of this just to make it a little easier to see, but it's right along the edge of this window frame is where we're looking. And I'll bring up that photo just so you can see it more directly. And that photo is a bit of a panorama here so that we can zoom in on these characters to read them a little better. So what this is actually pretty typical of the non-Chinese writing in the building. We have a name, we have kind of a hometown or home area, and a year. So it says Miyamoto from Hiroshima Prefecture, year 43, which is 1910. And from these writings, we know that people had something to write on the walls with. While people were treated much like prisoners and felt like prisoners, they weren't prisoners in the traditional sense. They were allowed to have personal items. They had knives and carving tools. So we believe that the walls, there are writings in ink and pencil as well, but a lot of what we can see today is the writing that's carved in, probably with a knife or carving tool. Now, the immigration officials did paint the building many times. There's about 7 layers of paint throughout the building, and that was to try and get rid of the graffiti as they saw it. But luckily, those carved inscriptions are still visible today, and as I said, help save this building from destruction. Now, as I move around the room, I want to show you a few more things. And one of the things that people often ask about is what life was like while you were here. And part of the reason that people were here so long was because of the medical process and the inspections that people were undergoing. Now, in the hospital, they are looking for deportable conditions. Now, those conditions change over time, but parasitic infections were a very common reason to attempt to deport people. Even ailments that were treatable at one time or another were considered deportable. So things like hookworm, liver fluke, any sort of contagious illness like tuberculosis or smallpox, yellow fever, plague. They're looking for all these big diseases. And this is the very early stages of what you might call scientific medicine. So they're using stethoscopes to listen to immigrants' lungs. They're collecting samples so they can look for evidence of parasitic infection under microscopes. They, on the far left, are flipping up the eyelids of immigrants to look for signs of trachoma, a disease that can rob someone of their eyesight if it goes untreated, but is very difficult to treat. So there were immigrant advocacy groups that helped the immigrants kind of fight the process here that was maybe trying to keep them out for medical reasons or for being Japanese. So the Japanese Association of America is one of those assistance groups that was specifically trying to help Japanese immigrants. There were other organizations like the Hebrew Aid Society, the YMCA, the YWCA, all working to advocate for people here. But as you can see, this is inside of one of the wards at the hospital, and this is actually the women's ward. We're actually working on restoring the hospital building so that we can open it to talk about these broader stories of immigration that have not been in the forefront of our storytelling to date, but also bring some of those stories into contemporary immigration as well. And the hospital building is just across the way from the detention barracks. And our exhibit design process is completed for about half the rooms in the building, a little more than half. And we'll be hopefully doing a virtual opening later this year and an in-person opening as conditions improve, but sometime in 2021. Now let me read you another poem from Carl here. He says, "America is my country, so my birth certificate says, but America doesn't want me here." Now, Carl Unida was an American citizen. He was born in the United States. The only way for Asian Americans to be Asian Americans, you could not naturalize, you could not become a citizen. The Japanese were the last group to be able to naturalize into American citizenship, and that didn't happen until the 1950s. Other Asians earned the right to naturalize in the 40s, and piece by piece, eventually the Japanese were allowed to naturalize as well. Now, because Carl was an American citizen, it means that during World War II, living in the West, he was interned. And this site became an internment camp after the immigration station closed. Now, the administration building we started off looking at burned down in 1940, and that was kind of the final straw to moving this immigration facility back to San Francisco and getting off of Angel Island, which posed a lot of logistical challenges of bringing witnesses out, food, water. While there is some natural water, the numbers of people living here at the time exceeded the capacity of that natural water source. So there was a lot of expense and effort involved with having a facility on an island. So they moved back to San Francisco when they lost that building that was central to the operation here. Now, during World War II, as I mentioned, we had internment here. Now, this was not a traditional internment camp. This was really a pass-through for people going on to other internment camps. And Carl Unida was not interned here. Most of the people that passed through here were actually Japanese Hawaiians. And they didn't intern a lot of people from Hawaii. And that is because local military officials basically made the case that if you were to intern everyone with Japanese ancestry in the Hawaiian Islands, there wouldn't be a lot of people there left to move forward with the war effort. Now, the very first prisoner of war at Pearl Harbor was actually held here temporarily on Angel Island. And his name was Kazu Sakamaki, and he was part of a two-man submarine that the other person in the sub did not survive. And Kazu was the only person captured / rescued. His ship was having a lot of technical issues. And so he was brought here to Angel Island and eventually went on to another prisoner of war camp. And again, this was a pass-through facility for people during World War II. Now, the Japanese Hawaiians that are being interned, they are mainly folks that are perceived to have closer ties to Japan by the American government. Now, this might simply be you follow the Buddhist religion, that you weren't Christian. It might be that you send money to Japan, maybe to an organization that is perceived as being supportive of the Japanese government. Even being involved with traditional sports like karate could get you interned. So the folks coming here are passing through, and they, for the most part, are ending up at Tule Lake. Again, because everyone from Hawaii was considered a higher level of risk. Now, Carl, American citizen, he is interned at Manzanar, I believe. And as I mentioned before, Manzanar, the only other National Historic Landmark dealing with Asian American history in the US. Both of these stories are darker stories in American history, these darker chapters of racism and discrimination that are taking place. Now, we have, at the end of the war, almost all prisoners of war from Japan passed through Angel Island. We did have a few come in from the Aleutian Islands in Alaska, and some of the South Pacific conflicts, but all Japanese prisoners of war, soldiers, were returned through Angel Island to Japan at the end of the war. And so we see writing from them as well. And I'd like to take you on a little walk over here so that we can see some of those inscriptions. Now, the room I'm walking into was a sitting room during the immigration era, but probably used as a sleeping area by World War II. And I'll reverse the camera for you here so that you can see this writing. And it is in pencil. Now, the writing from World War II is not carved into the walls because the people were considered more of a physical risk to the guards here than the immigration era. People wrote in pencil and in other substances, potentially chalk or soap. Now, this inscription is very typical of what you might expect a prisoner of war to write. It talks about a group of about 700 from Camp McCoy. Camp McCoy is in Wisconsin, and so this is from the end of the war when they are being repatriated. And it gives the date and their possible destination being returned to Japan. All right, so let me read you another poem from Carl. I hear sounds of different voices from the next cells. Chinese, Russian, Mexican, Greek, Italian. Voices of sorrow, nostalgia, rage, and passion. So as you can see, there were immigrants, as I said, coming from all over the world here. The Japanese immigrants that were detained here, they experienced shorter stays, low rates of deportation, less than 2% were deported. And there were people that came that did stay here longer. And one of those people was a woman, and her name is Miyono Nojima. Now, Miyono, she has the longest stay on record for anyone coming from Japan. And she was here for 8 months. Now, she was not here for 8 months all at one time. She actually was detained here twice. The first time for 6 months and the second time for 2 months. And the reason she was detained is because she and her husband had lived in the US, in the Northwest, gone back to Japan. They'd had 2 children while they were living here in the United States. When they returned to Japan, they thought it would be for a short amount of time, which was allowed under immigration law. You could travel and return. Well, her husband returns, but she's in poor health. One of her children is in poor health. So she stays behind. She's taking care of her mother-in-law as she ages as well, and ends up, instead of coming back in a few months or even a year, stays 15 years in Japan. So when she attempts to return, they realize that she will probably not be allowed to immigrate under the immigration laws of the time. So she goes about getting a false visa, stating that she left just a year before her attempt to re-enter the United States in 1931. Now, that false visa apparently was part of a large scheme, that a black market of visas, and the immigration officials were aware of this and really pushed hard when they questioned her about her visa. She admits to the fraud and throws herself on the mercy of the Immigration Service to forgive her going about this without proper documentation. She makes it very clear that her husband was not involved with this and he didn't know about the false paperwork. And her husband is very concerned. They've been separated, and he is concerned that she might take her life and warns the immigration officials to keep an eye out for her. Now, her 2 children that were born here in the United States, they were allowed to come in, but she was eventually deported because she had these false papers. She returns to Japan, her husband visits, they have 2 more children, and eventually, with the assistance of a lawyer, she attempts to enter the country again. This leads to her second detention at Angel Island for 2 months, where apparently the lawyer had some connections in Washington, D.C. that finally kind of greased the wheels to get her into the country. Now, they settle in Nevada, and the irony of this situation is that they are not living in the West when World War II starts, or after the Pearl Harbor attack. And so they are not interned, but their children and grandchildren who were living in California were interned. And so she went and visited her children and grandchildren in the internment camps. And one of her grandchildren talked about being confused by the fact that their grandmother, who was born in Japan, was not in the internment camp, and they, who were born here, were. So we have a lot of these stories of repetitive detention when it comes to Japanese and Japanese American stories relating to Angel Island. And there were some people that were detained here as immigrants and detained here temporarily during internment. Now, about 85,000 Japanese immigrants passed through Angel Island in the 30 years it was open. I want to give you one more poem from Carl before I move into our last room. Pain and ache have disappeared in this detention room after writing several poems for the first time in a month. So Carl, like many of the people here, found some comfort in writing poems. And we see poems in many different languages, as I said, in the newspapers. And it seems to have been a common way for people to express their feelings. This is a recreation room where people could spend time inside. There was also an exterior recreation room. And just so we don't pass it up, I'll show you this room meant to represent the World War II time period. And we have a photo here of Kazu. And this is what I mean by captured / rescued. He looks very happy to have survived his ordeal in the submarine. And there were prisoners of war from Germany here as well. The folks writing these poems talked about all the different experiences here. They talked about the long detention. They talked about the bad food in the dining hall. There were lots of complaints about the food. The Europeans and Chinese immigrants, they complained that the food was bad. The Japanese immigrants complained that the food was Chinese, but eventually some Chinese food was brought in. You can see one of our hearings here. Now, the women that were coming in as picture brides usually didn't have to answer many questions, but the most important question is, what were they going to do when they arrived here? And the answer was housework. Basically, the only acceptable answer was that you were going to work in the home. If you were going to work outside of the home, you would be classified as a laborer and excluded. And the Japanese immigrants were well aware of these restrictions and made sure to answer these questions in a manner that wouldn't stop them from being allowed to immigrate. They would have translators and inspectors writing everything down, and those transcripts exist today. If you think you have a relative that came through the immigration station, or really through the port of San Francisco, even beyond the years of 1910 to 1940, before or after, those records are mostly available in the National Archives in San Bruno. And you can see transcripts from folks that were here. They often have photographs and a lot of information that might be helpful to a family history. So I wanted to come over here to one of the Chinese poems that's a little more visible in this room. And there's writing, as I said, all over the walls here. And this poem is a very emotional poem. It says, "1,000 sorrows and a hatred 10,000-fold burns between my brows. Hoping to step ashore the American continent is the most difficult of difficulties. The barbarians imprison me in this place. Even a martyr or a hero would change countenance." So you can see here a lot of the frustration that many people were experiencing when they were here. So I want to wind up by reading one more poem from Carl, and can kind of tell this is towards the end of his stay here. He was here for about 2 months. "Since detention here, I have forgotten the villagers who hated and some who loved me. Freedom is the only thought in my mind." And that is the story here for Japanese and Japanese Americans that passed through here. Many of them, their freedoms were being restricted. Many had the opportunity to go on and make lives for themselves here in the United States. They were very fortunate in their low deportation rates during the immigration era. But it's a story that we want to make sure that we don't forget. All the stories here from all of the different people that came here from around the world are often stories that might not be told. And if this building had been torn down as a plan to create recreation space, if that had gone forward, we might not be telling these stories. So we're very grateful to those students and their professors, to that ranger, and to this next generation that's sharing their stories of immigration with us as well. So I want to thank you all for coming and spending a little time with me here at Angel Island State Park. And we hope that in the future, when the time is right, you'll come and visit us. We do have some virtual programs that we can do live with you or a group if you would like to learn more about the history here at Angel Island State Park. Thank you all very much, and I hope you have a wonderful day.